I spent 15 years building a career that felt like a masterpiece to the world, only to realize I was the one trapped inside the frame. The air in the 42nd floor boardroom of Vane and Associates was thick with the scent of expensive mahogany and the silent, cold desperation of a dozen junior associates. I sat at the far end of the table, my fingers tracing the edge of a legal motion I didn't believe in, a motion designed to bury a small whistleblower family under a mountain of frivolous litigation. Across from me sat Julian Vane. To the legal world, he was a titan. To me, he was the man who held the keys to my gilded cage. He was mid-monologue, his voice smooth as silk but sharp as a razor, talking about market pragmatism and the necessity of corporate survival. As he spoke, voice one, my survival instinct, started screaming in the back of my skull. You know that voice. It's the loud, primal critic that feeds on fear. Stay in the room, Catelyn, it whispered. Look at the view. Look at the six-figure bonus. If you speak up, if you challenge Julian, you'll be a nobody. You'll lose the safety of the firm. This was the inner critic Graham Weaver warned us about, the one that pushes for safety until your life feels so small you can barely breathe. I looked at Julian. He was the nail in my head. I had been stuck for 5 years, following rules that limited my soul, yet I was too terrified of the initial discomfort of change to pull myself free. The breaking point didn't happen in that boardroom. It happened during our annual off-site retreat in the Hamptons. Surrounded by luxury villas and the finest wines, I felt like I was suffocating. While Julian was busy toasting to unyielding dominance, I did something I had never done. I slipped out the back door. I didn't take my phone, I didn't take my keys, I just started running. I ran past the manicured hedges, my professional clothes damp with sweat, until the sounds of the cocktail party were replaced by the rhythmic thud of my sneakers on the pavement. I ran until my lungs burned and the survival voice finally ran out of breath. And in that silence, I heard it. Voice two. It wasn't a shout. It was a profound, internal resonance. It was my inner truth, my soul, telling me that I was dying in that high-rise office. It communicated through a surge of energy I hadn't felt since I was a child. It wasn't telling me what to do, it was telling me who I was. I wasn't a corporate shark, I was a seeker of justice. As I stood there, drenched in sweat under the Atlantic sun, the first promise formed, take the nail out of your head. I had to admit I was stuck. I knew that the moment I resigned, my life would technically worsen in the eyes of my peers. I would lose the salary and the protection of the Vane name. But as I looked back at the distant, glittering pavilion, I realized that staying was a slow suicide. I walked back, not to join the party, but to pack my bags. I didn't hedge. I didn't wait for the right moment, because I finally understood that the right moment is a lie created by fear. I was going to follow my energy, even if it led me into a storm. Julian Vane thought he owned my future, but he didn't realize that a woman who has found her second voice is a woman who can no longer be controlled. I was going all in. Leaving Vane and Associates wasn't the clean break I had imagined while running through the Hamptons. It was a messy, bone-chilling descent into the unknown. When I walked into Julian's office the following Monday and handed him my resignation, he didn't scream. He didn't even look up from his digital tablet. He just let out a short, dry laugh, the kind of sound a predator makes when it knows the prey has nowhere else to go. You'll be back in 6 months, Moore, he said, finally lifting his cold blue eyes to mine. You've spent 15 years breathing rarefied air. Out there, in the real world, you'll find that the truth doesn't pay the mortgage. You're addicted to the safety I provide, and addiction is a hard habit to break. His words hit me like a physical blow. Immediately, voice one, my survival instinct, began its frantic calculations. He's right, it hissed. You have a mortgage on a Central Park apartment. You have a reputation. You're 38 years old. You can't just start over in a basement office. That inner critic was pulling me back toward the safety of the cage, trying to convince me that my life was too small to survive without Julian's shadow. But I remembered the first promise, take the nail out of your head. I had to admit that I was stuck, not because of Julian, but because I had allowed my fear to name the rules of my life. I walked out of that skyscraper with a single box of belongings and a vibration in my chest that felt like an electric current. I didn't have a plan, but I had energy. I rented a cramped, brick-walled office in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn. It smelled of old paper and industrial floor cleaner, a far cry from the lavender-scented halls of Vane and Associates. The nail was out, but the wound was fresh. Graham Weaver warned that things often get worse before they get better, and my life was about to become a living testament to that. For the first 3 weeks, the phone didn't ring. I sat at a scarred wooden desk, staring at the peeling paint on the walls while my bank account drained. Every morning, the fear-driven voice one would greet me with a list of my failures. You're a nobody now. Julian has blacklisted you. You threw away a legacy for a feeling in a vineyard. To silence that voice, I had to be honest about my nail. I wrote it down on a yellow legal pad. I am afraid that I am only valuable when I am protecting the powerful. Naming the obstacle was the first step to destroying it. I wasn't just a lawyer. I was a woman who had spent 15 years helping giants crush the weak. The nail wasn't my job, it was my complicity. Then, on a rainy Tuesday, the door creaked open. A woman walked in, her face etched with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Her name was Sarah Miller. She was a scientist, or rather, a former scientist at Gentech, a pharmaceutical conglomerate that happened to be Vane and Associates' largest client. I heard you left, she whispered, her eyes darting to the door as if Julian's shadow might follow her in. They told me you were the best, but they also said you lost your mind. I found it actually, I replied, gesturing for her to sit. Tell me why you're here. Sarah laid out a story that made my blood run cold. She had discovered a flaw in Gentech's new cardiovascular drug, a flaw that caused fatal complications in nearly 12% of the test subjects. She had brought it to her superiors, and within 48 hours, her data had been sanitized. Her husband, also a researcher, had died in a suspicious car accident, and she had been served with an NDA that carried a $10 million penalty. Julian Vane personally signed the enforcement notice, she said, her voice trembling. He told me that if I spoke a single word, he would make sure I spent the rest of my life in a cage. Catelyn, I'm terrified, but I can't let more people die. As she spoke, I felt it, voice too. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a roar. My energy didn't just spike, it harmonized. This was the 9 lives exercise in real time. I could see the life where I turned her away and went back to Julian to beg for my job. That life felt like lead. But the life where I stood in front of a judge and fought for Sarah, that life glowed. I realized then that following your passion is a myth because passion is fickle. But energy is the language of the soul. My soul was energized by the prospect of justice, even if it meant total war with Julian Vane. They have unlimited resources, Sarah, I said, my voice gritty and resonant. They have the best legal minds money can buy. And they have Julian, who knows exactly how to drive a nail into someone's head until they stop fighting. So you won't take the case, she asked, her eyes welling up. I stood up and walked to the window. Across the street, a black SUV with tinted windows sat idling. Julian's watchers. He wasn't just waiting for me to fail, he was actively ensuring it. He wanted me to choose safety. He wanted me to listen to the voice of fear and come crawling back. I turned back to Sarah. I won't just take the case. I'm going to dismantle them. But we have to make a promise right now. We don't hedge, we don't wait for the right moment to strike. We go all in now. If we do this, my life and yours will get much harder before we see the sun. Are you ready for the discomfort? Sarah straightened her shoulders, a spark of my own grit reflecting in her eyes. I lost everything when my husband died. I'm ready. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Julian's private line. When he answered, I didn't wait for his smug greeting. Julian, I said, my hazel eyes fixed on the black SUV outside. I'm naming the truth. I'm the lead counsel for Sarah Miller in a wrongful death and racketeering suit against Gentech, the Bar Association complaint you filed. You might want to save that energy. You're going to need it for the trial. I hung up. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the silence of a predator who had just realized the prey was no longer running. I was unstuck. I was following the energy. And for the first time in my 38 years, I was living at full power. The war of attrition didn't start with a bang, it started with 1,000 tiny cuts. Within 48 hours of my call to Julian, my bank accounts were frozen pending an internal audit of my departure from the firm. My landlord in Brooklyn received a mysterious tip that my warehouse office wasn't zoned for legal practice. The Bar Association fast-tracked the ethics complaint, and suddenly, I was looking at a temporary suspension of my license before I could even file the first motion for Sarah. Julian Vane was doing exactly what he had done for 30 years. He was driving the nail back in. Voice one was screaming now, a deafening siren of panic. You're losing everything, Catelyn. You're isolated. You're a pariah. If you just drop the case and sign a non-disclosure agreement, Julian will make this all go away. He'll give you your life back. But I sat in my darkened office, the only light coming from a single desk lamp, and I realized something profound. That life he was offering to give back was the very thing that had been killing me. It was a life built on willpower, on the sheer, grinding effort of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Willpower is a finite battery. It runs out when the pressure gets too high. But energy is regenerative. I decided to perform the 9 lives exercise I had once heard a mentor describe. I closed my eyes and imagined 9 different versions of Catelyn Moore starting from this very second. In one life, I went back to Julian and apologized. I saw myself at 50, wealthy, respected, and hollowed out like a rotted tree. In another, I moved to a small town and worked a quiet job, forever wondering what if. But in the 9th life, I was standing in a courtroom, staring down the man who thought he owned the truth. That version of me, the one in the arena, was the only one that vibrated with light. That was where the energy was. "I'm not following a passion for law," I whispered into the empty room. "I'm following the energy of the truth." I turned my attention back to the discovery files Sarah had smuggled out. They were encrypted with a military-grade prime number sequence. Julian thought I was a big picture lawyer, the kind who delegated the technical grunt work to associates. He didn't realize that in my first 3 years at the firm, when I was trying to prove my worth, I had taught myself how the firm's proprietary encryption worked. I knew the language. Julian used to hide his secrets. The energy hit me then, a flow state so deep that the outside world ceased to exist. For 72 hours, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I followed the numbers. I was looking for Aegis Consulting, a shell company I had seen mentioned in passing during my time at the firm. I found it buried in a subdirectory of the Gen Tech clinical trials. Aegis wasn't a consulting firm. It was a clearinghouse for hush money. Every time a scientist raised a red flag about the drug, Aegis was paid a maintenance fee. But the payments didn't go to the scientists. They went to a private equity fund owned by Julian's brother-in-law. It was a closed loop of corruption. Julian wasn't just defending Gen Tech. He was a silent partner in the profits of their deception. Just as I hit the final decryption key, a heavy knock thudded against my office door. My heart hammered against my ribs. The survival voice immediately jumped to assassin. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Sterling, the lead associate Julian had promoted to take my office. He looked pale, his usually pristine suit rumpled. I opened the door, keeping the chain on. "A bit late for a social call, Sterling." "He's going to destroy you, Catelyn," Sterling whispered, his eyes darting to the shadows of the hallway. "He knows you're in the Aegis files. He's already preparing a criminal referral for theft of trade secrets. If you file that motion, you're not just losing your license. You're going to prison." "Then why are you here, Sterling? To save me? Or to save yourself because you're the one who signed the Aegis wire transfers?" He flinched. The nail in his head was so deep he could barely see past his own fear. He was exactly where I had been a year ago, hedging his bets, waiting for a safe moment that would never come. "You have a choice, Sterling," I said, my voice steady and gritty. "You can stay in the cage and wait for the door to lock, or you can follow the energy of the only thing that can save you, the truth. Give me the password for the Cayman accounts, and I'll make sure Judge Miller knows you were a cooperating witness." "I can't," he choked out. "I have a family. I have a career." "You don't have a career," I countered. "You have a job as a janitor for Julian's dirty laundry. Look at me, Sterling. Does it look like I'm losing? I've never been more powerful in my life." He looked at me, really looked at me, and saw the hazel eyes of a woman who was no longer afraid of the dark. He saw the second voice in action. For a split second, I saw his resolve waver. But then, the elevator down the hall dinged. Sterling panicked and ran back toward the stairs. He hadn't made the promise yet. He was still hedging. I went back to my desk and looked at the screen. I didn't need Sterling's password. He had given it to me without realizing it. On his wrist, he had been wearing a commemorative watch from the firm's 20th anniversary, the same year Julian had incorporated Aegis. The password was the date of the firm's founding. I typed it in. The screen flashed green. The entire ledger of Julian Vane's 30-year history of corruption spilled out before me. It wasn't just Gen Tech, it was dozens of companies. Julian hadn't built a law firm, he had built a machine that turned silence into gold. The energy in the room was electric. I felt an abundance of strength that had nothing to do with caffeine or willpower. I was no longer a victim of Julian's power, I was the architect of his reckoning. I had followed the energy through the maze, and I had arrived at the center. I picked up my pen and began drafting the emergency motion for a pre-trial discovery hearing. I didn't wait for morning. I didn't wait for the Bar Association to rule on my license. I went all in, right then, in the middle of the night. Because when you finally hear that second voice, you realize that the right moment isn't something you wait for, it's something you create. The filing of the emergency motion was the equivalent of pulling the pin on a grenade and dropping it in the center of Julian's meticulously manicured life. By the time the sun rose over the East River, I wasn't just a lawyer anymore, I was a target. The morning of the hearing, the U.S. District Court was a fortress. Julian's team had spent the night filing countermotions, claiming the Aegis ledgers were privileged trade secrets stolen by a disgruntled, mentally unstable former employee. Voice 1 was back, louder than ever, feeding me headlines of my own destruction. They'll put you in handcuffs before you even reach the podium, Catelyn. You're overplaying your hand. No one takes down Julian Vane, but I didn't fight the voice. I just acknowledged it, named it as fear, and turned my attention back to the vibration in my chest. The energy was still there, steady and cold. I walked into the courtroom wearing a sharp black suit, my dark brown hair pulled back so tight it felt like armor. Julian was already there, sitting at the defense table. He looked impeccable, but as I approached, I noticed a slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his silk tie. For the first time in 15 years, I saw him not as a titan, but as a man desperately trying to keep a nail from being pulled out of his own head. Judge Harold Miller entered the room. He was a man of the old school, silver-haired, with deep-set eyes that had seen every trick in the book. He looked at the mountain of paperwork on his bench and then at me. "Ms. Moore," Miller began, his voice gravelly and resonant. "The defense has filed a motion to have you removed as counsel, citing theft of proprietary data. They are also asking for an immediate gag order. Before we get to the merits of your discovery request, I need to know why I shouldn't have the marshals escort you out of this building right now." I stood up. The room was silent, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and high stakes. This was the moment of Graham Weaver's third promise. Go all in now. There was no more hedging, no more playing it safe. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Vane is correct about one thing. The data I am presenting today was never meant to be seen. But it wasn't stolen. It was liberated. For 15 years, I sat in the room where these decisions were made. I followed the rules of market pragmatism that Mr. Vane preaches. I ignored the second voice, the one that tells us that the law is meant to protect the Sarah Millers of the world, not the bank accounts of Gen Tech. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the decrypted Aegis memo, the one Julian had signed personally. This document isn't a trade secret, Your Honor. It is a death warrant. It outlines a mathematical formula for how many lives Gen Tech could afford to lose before the lawsuits became more expensive than the profits. Julian Vane didn't just defend this company, he architected a system to hide the bodies. If you remove me, you aren't protecting the law, you are protecting the machine. Julian stood up, his face reddening. This is a theatrical performance by a woman whose career is in freefall. Sit down, Mr. Vane, Judge Miller snapped. The room gasped. Miller leaned forward, looking at the document I had placed on the clerk's desk. He stayed silent for what felt like an eternity, his wise eyes scanning the lines of numbers and Julian's unmistakable signature. "Mr. Vane," Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I have known you for 20 years. I have watched you win cases that seemed impossible, but I have never seen a ledger that assigns a dollar value to human life quite so clearly as this." He turned back to me. "Ms. Moore, the motion to remove you is denied. The motion for a gag order is denied. In fact, I am granting your request for full discovery of the Aegis accounts. Furthermore, I am notifying the Department of Justice that this court has found evidence of criminal racketeering." The gavel struck the wood, a sound like a gunshot. The nail was finally out. As the courtroom descended into chaos, Julian turned to me. His cold blue eyes were no longer condescending. They were filled with a pure, predatory hatred. "You think this is a victory, Catelyn?" he hissed, leaning over the bar. "You've just ensured that no one in the city will ever trust you again. You've broken the one rule that matters, loyalty to the hand that feeds you." "That hand was feeding me poison, Julian," I replied, my hazel eyes meeting his without a hint of tremor. "I'm not looking for trust from people like you. I'm following the energy of the people you tried to bury, and right now, that energy is a tidal wave." I walked out of the courtroom, leaving the army of associates and the flashing cameras behind. I found Sarah Miller in the hallway. She couldn't speak, she just took my hand and squeezed it. The discomfort Weaver promised was far from over. I knew Julian would launch a scorched earth campaign. He would come for my house, my name, my very safety. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, the Atlantic wind whipping around me, I didn't feel the drain of willpower. I felt the abundance of power that comes from alignment. I had named the truth, I had followed the energy, and I had gone all in. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. For the first time in my 38 years, I wasn't waiting for the right moment. I was the moment. The victory in the courtroom was a flare in the dark, but it didn't mean the war was over. Julian Vane wasn't just a lawyer. He was a gatekeeper of the city's elite, and as the news of the Aegis ledgers broke, the gatekeepers began to close ranks. By the time I returned to my Brooklyn warehouse, the voice one in my head had transitioned from a whisper of panic to a steady drone of tactical dread. It reminded me that a cornered predator is twice as dangerous. That night, the discomfort Graham Weaver promised reached its peak. I arrived at my office to find the door kicked in. My files were scattered like snow, and my laptop, the one containing the raw Aegis data, was gone. They hadn't just come for the data, they had left a message. On my desk, pinned with a heavy brass paperweight, was a photo of me from 10 years ago, smiling next to Julian at a charity gala. Across my face, someone had carved a single word in the wood: traitor. I stood in the wreckage, the smell of industrial cleaner and dust filling my lungs. For a moment, my willpower flickered. I felt the weight of the 15 years I had spent building a reputation, only to have it demolished in a single week. My survival instinct screamed at me to run, to take Sarah Miller and disappear before Julian did something more than just break a door. But then, I did the 9 lives exercise again. I didn't need to close my eyes this time. I looked at the word traitor carved into my desk. I realized that to Julian, loyalty meant silence in the face of murder. To me, loyalty meant honoring the second voice, the inner truth that had guided me out of the Hamptons and into this fight. The version of Catelyn Moore that surrendered now was a version that would never breathe freely again. The energy came back, not as a spark, but as a cold, hard flame. I didn't need the laptop. I had already uploaded the encrypted ledgers to a decentralized cloud server, a trick I'd learned from a whistleblower I'd once helped Julian discredit. "You're looking for the wrong thing, Julian," I whispered to the empty room. I spent the next 48 hours in a motel room, working off a burner phone and a borrowed tablet. I was no longer just a lawyer, I was a hunter. I followed the energy of the Aegis wire transfers until I found the final piece of the puzzle, the Aegis ledger. It wasn't just a list of hush money. It was a map of every political favor, every bribed regulator, and every suppressed study Gen Tech had ever paid for. And at the center of it all was a secret account linked to Julian's personal foundation. The hearing for the final injunction was set for Thursday. I knew this was the all-in moment. Julian's team had spent the last 2 days leaking stories to the press about my mental breakdown and substance abuse issues at the firm. They were trying to discredit the messenger because they couldn't discredit the message. As I walked into the U.S. District Court for the final showdown, the air felt electric. Julian was standing in the center of the aisle, surrounded by a phalanx of security. He looked at me with a smirk, a man who believed his web was too large to be broken. "This is the end of the line, Catelyn," he said as I passed. "The Bar Association just issued an emergency suspension of your license. You have no standing to speak in this court." I didn't stop. I walked straight to the counsel table and set my briefcase down. "I'm not here as a lawyer today, Julian. I'm here as a witness for the Department of Justice." Judge Harold Miller entered the room. He looked older, the weight of the evidence I had already provided clearly taking its toll. He looked at Julian's team and then at me. "Ms. Moore," Miller said, his voice heavy, "I have received a notice of your suspension. Under normal circumstances, I would ask you to leave. However, I have also received a federal subpoena from the U.S. Attorney's Office, naming you as a key informant in an active RICO investigation." The color drained from Julian's face. The cold blue eyes that had intimidated me for a decade suddenly looked hollow. I stood up and held up my digital tablet. The screen was mirrored to the large monitors in the courtroom. "Your Honor, what you are seeing is the Aegis ledger. It shows that over the last 10 years, Julian Vane didn't just hide Gen Tech's crimes, he profited from them to the tune of $40 million. He didn't just defend the drug, he owned the lab that falsified the safety data." I looked directly at Julian. His mask of absolute certainty finally cracked. He slumped into his chair, the nail in his head finally manifesting as the reality of his own ruin. He had spent his life following the voice of survival, the voice of greed and safety, and it had led him to a cage of his own making. "I spent years afraid of you, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "I thought you were the source of my power, but you were just the obstacle. I had to lose everything you gave me to find the one thing you could never take, my truth." Judge Miller struck his gavel. The court will recess while the federal marshals take custody of the evidence. Mr. Vane, you are not to leave the building. As the marshals moved toward Julian, I walked out of the courtroom. The survival voice was silent. There was no more fear, no more anxiety about what would happen next. I had gone all in, and the internal conflict that had defined my life for 15 years had dissolved. I stood in the center of the rotunda, the sun streaming through the high windows. I was a 38-year-old woman with a suspended license, a trashed office, and an uncertain future. But as I breathed in the cold, sharp air of the courthouse, I felt a level of power I had never known. I wasn't living a life that felt small anymore. I was living at full power. The aftermath of the courtroom reveal wasn't the celebratory montage I had once imagined. It was a cold, surgical extraction. As the federal marshals moved in to secure Julian's files, the halls of the courthouse felt like they were vibrating with the weight of a dying empire. I stood by the stone pillars, watching as the man who had loomed over my life like a god was led into a private side room for questioning. He didn't look back at me. He couldn't. Graham Weaver's framework had warned me that the third promise, go all in, now wasn't just about the leap. It was about the landing. And the landing was hard. My name was splashed across every major news outlet. To some, I was a hero, the whistleblower of Wall Street. To others, specifically the elite legal circles I had spent my life trying to impress, I was a pariah, the woman who had broken the cardinal rule of attorney-client privilege. Voice One was back with a vengeance that night. As I sat in my motel room, eating cold takeout and watching the blinking lights of the city, the survival voice started its final assault. You're 38, Catelyn. You've successfully dismantled your career. Even if Julian goes to prison, who will ever hire you again? You're radioactive. You traded a corner office for a lifetime of looking over your shoulder. But for the first time in my life, that voice sounded like a stranger. It was just noise, the frantic buzzing of a trapped insect. I leaned back and listened for voice two. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in the deep, rhythmic calm of my own breathing. It told me that the safety I had lost was a lie, and the discomfort I was feeling was the sensation of muscles growing. The next morning, I met Sarah Miller at a small diner near the pier. She looked different. The shadows under her eyes were still there, but the trembling had stopped. She pushed a small, tattered notebook across the table toward me. My husband's notes, she said softly. He didn't just track the Gen Tech failures. He tracked the people who tried to stop them. There's a list, Catelyn, other scientists, other families who were paid off or threatened into silence. Julian didn't just hide one drug. He managed a network of suppressed truths across the entire industry. I looked at the list. My energy didn't just spike, it expanded. I realized that my 9 lives exercise hadn't ended in the courtroom. This was the beginning of the next life. I wasn't just a lawyer who had taken down a titan. I was the only person who knew how the machine worked from the inside. The federal investigation will handle Julian, I said, my voice gritty and resonant. But the Department of Justice moves slowly. They care about the crime, they don't always care about the people. These families, they need more than a conviction. They need restitution. They need their voices back. But your license, Sarah reminded me, her brow furrowing. The Bar Association is still coming for you. Let them come, I replied, a slow, determined smile spreading across my face. I spent 15 years following their rules to protect the wrong people. If they want to take my license because I chose the truth over Julian Vane's secrets, then that license wasn't worth having. I'll fight them, Sarah. And while I do, I'm going to use every ounce of energy I have to ensure these families are heard. I spent the rest of the week going all in on a different kind of strategy. I wasn't hedging. I wasn't looking for a safe way to pivot. I reached out to a small group of investigative journalists and public interest lawyers, people I would have looked down on a year ago from my high-rise office. I gave them the roadmap. I showed them where the nails were hidden in the industry. By Friday, the internal conflict that had plagued me since that run in the Hamptons was gone. I had stopped trying to balance my survival with my soul. I had chosen my soul, and in doing so, I had unlocked a reservoir of energy that willpower could never touch. I received a final message from Sterling, Julian's former associate. He had been indicted as a co-conspirator, but he had taken my advice and turned state's evidence. I saw you on the news, he wrote. You look like you've finally stopped running. I wish I'd had the courage to jump when you did. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I looked at my reflection in the diner window. My hazel eyes were sharp, my expression resilient. I was a woman who had pulled the nail out, followed the energy through the fire, and committed herself to the truth without a safety net. The meaning of my life wasn't in a title or a paycheck. It was in the fact that I was finally living at full power. Julian Vane had tried to erase me, but all he had done was strip away the layers of fear that were keeping me from seeing who I really was. I was ready for the final chapter. Not because I knew I would win, but because I knew I was finally on the right side of the fight. The final gavel didn't just end a trial, it punctuated the end of a 15-year lie. Standing in the rotunda of the U.S. District Court, watching the evening light filter through the high arched windows, I felt a stillness I hadn't known since I was a child. The chaos of the last few months, the threats, the ruined office, the loss of my standing, felt like a distant storm that had finally cleared the air. Julian Vane had been led away in handcuffs, his empire dismantled by the very truth he thought he had buried. But the real victory wasn't the handcuffs. It was the feeling in my chest. For the first time in my 38 years, Voice One was quiet. The inner critic that had spent decades demanding I stay safe, stay quiet, and stay in the cage had finally run out of arguments. I had survived the discomfort Graham Weaver promised. I had walked through the fire of losing my masterpiece career and found that I was still standing. Better yet, I was finally awake. I looked at Sarah Miller, who stood beside me. She wasn't just a client anymore. She was a testament to what happens when you stop hedging. Because we went all in, thousands of families would now get the medical monitoring they deserved. Because we followed the energy of the truth instead of the safety of the firm, the Aegis machine was broken. What will you do now? Sarah asked, her voice light for the first time. The Bar Association, they'll take years to decide on your license. I looked out at the city skyline, the glittering towers where I used to spend 18 hours a day chasing a ghost. They can take the license, Sarah. They can't take the knowledge. I'm going to start a firm that doesn't look like Vane's. No mahogany boardrooms, no secret ledgers, just the truth. We're going to help the people the Titans try to erase. I realized then that the meaning of my life wasn't to be a successful lawyer by the world's standards. It was to live at full power. That meant waking up every day and making those 3 promises again. To take the nail out whenever I felt stuck. To follow the energy of what set my soul on fire. To go all in without a safety net, because that is where life truly begins. I walked down the courthouse steps, not toward a waiting car, but toward the open street. I felt an abundance of energy, a regenerative power that didn't come from a bonus check or a title. It came from being exactly who I was meant to be. I was Catelyn Moore. I was a seeker of justice. And for the first time, I was free. If you're feeling stuck today, if you feel that nail of fear or a career that feels like a cage, remember that your second voice is waiting for you to listen. It won't be easy, and it will definitely be uncomfortable. But I can tell you from the other side, the view from the arena is worth everything you have to leave behind. Don't wait for the right moment. The right moment is a myth. Go all in, now.